Welcome to Savannah Podcast Meetup. I'm Henrik de Gior. Today we have a series of guests and a co-host, of course. Raz, co-host and founder of Savannah Podcast Meetup. You want to go first?
Yeah, so I'm Raz, owner of Podcast on the Go and founder of Savannah Podcast Meetup. I've been podcasting for about 7 years now. Own a company called Podcast on the Go, and we are a booking site for podcasting studios. So I'm looking to grow that platform so that people can find a studio near them and level up their podcast.
And we have a guest, Brett.
Yeah, Brett de Gior from Toronto, Ontario. And I'm just here to learn about podcasting.
Excellent. You're in the right place.
Yeah, welcome.
And I'm Henrik de Gior. I'm a consultant, podcaster, and a writer. I have about now 8 podcast series. And today we're going to be talking about the how to become a better podcast host. So I think we have some things to share around that, both before, during, and after the show recording would be the way to think about it as a host. Raz, do you have anything to share up front or?
Yeah, so I like the way you put it is before, during, and after. So you want to just go with that layout, and we'll just talk about stuff we can do before. Mm-hmm. So before, preparation is key. There's a podcast called The Turnaround, and it's by a guy named, I'm going to forget his name. I don't know his name, but the podcast is called The Turnaround with, I think it's Jesse, but I might be lying. But what he does is he interviews some of the best interviewers in the world. So he's turning the mic around, and it's a really great podcast to get insight into what the greatest hosts think and do before, during, and after a show. You know, he interviewed NPR hosts. He interviewed Larry King. He interviewed who was some other great Ira Glass. He had him on there. So just really, really brilliant interviewers. And preparation was key. It was huge. So especially when it comes to really diving deep on a topic. And that's somewhere where I fell off when I first started, because I just wanted to get to know people. But as you level up your guests, they want to know that you've read their book, that you know something about them, that you listened to their speeches before. They want to know that they're not just, that they're talking to somebody who is educated on the topic. You know, if you're just interviewing local entrepreneurs and business owners who own a lawn care company, you know, you can kind of wing it a little bit. But if you're interviewing somebody who's an influencer, then you have to prepare quite a bit.
For sure. Yeah, it's The Turnaround with Jesse Thorne, a Jesse, and then Thorne, like I have a thorn on a rose.
Yeah. I'm glad somebody thought to use Google. Thanks.
Yeah, you're right. Yes, thank you, Google. So definitely, I think it's easier to make it a repeatable process as far as having a model to repeat the invite process to not only entice people to be a guest on your show. Obviously, it's harder in the very beginning because you're not a known quantity yet, right? Unless you're a well-known personality or something like that. So I reach out typically to my network first, right? My preferred network happens to be LinkedIn, because most of my podcasts are around business niche business topics. And so I reach out on those networks. You may have a different network on, say, Facebook or some other social network, or your email list, or whatever that looks like, depending on what your show's about, right? But having a repeatable process, preparing, to Raz's point, is really important. Using email templates is huge as far as making it a repeatable process, because your invite should look pretty much the same, right? So my email process is like, I'd love to have you as a podcast guest on said show, you know, tell the show name, give a link to it, invite them to listen or subscribe to the show so that they have so that they prepare too, right? So they know the format, you know, oh, this is going to be conversational. This is going to be interview style. Here's potentially the questions up front, and you give them up front so that you have transparency to the host, to the guest, right? As a host, saying, I'm not going to surprise you with, you know, like super hard questions, and you're going to be like, I don't know. It would take me 3 years to figure out some answers to that. But things that are relevant to them, right? Because if it's not relevant to them, they're probably going to say, nah, not for me. Mm-hmm. And make it potentially generic enough that it can be geared towards them, but don't invite just anybody to any show, right? Because you're not going to get the right audience for that, or the right guests, more importantly. And then it's going to be harder to retain an audience if you don't have a set theme, that kind of thing. So keep all that together. If there's a product or service mentioned, see if there's an affiliate deal, right, or a marketing deal to be had prior to the show, right? So if there's some kind of affiliate deal where, oh, well, because said guest is on the show, we're going to try to do a deal and provide the audience, more importantly, a deal for said service or product. So if you have an author, for example, I have authors on a regular basis on my shows, because they're very easy to come by if they're on your topic, right? And you say, oh, I'll promote your book, just mention your book, and I'll make sure that the link is in the show notes with an affiliate deal to, say, Amazon affiliates, where you get a percentage of each sale of the book if they click on your link. So it's all good things, the way to propagate the interest in said business or said product, and gain a little bit of insight and potentially some money on the side to continue propagating what you want to do.
Right.
Yep.
Please,
go ahead.
Go ahead. Sorry.
No. And then I think also addressing, like, just before you record, obviously greet them before you start recording, but make sure you address what happens, especially if you're doing this kind of format. What happens if you have drop-offs, if you have mishaps in, oh, I said that sentence wrong, can I do that again? Basically, I tell them, stop, re-say the whole sentence, and then in the editing process, because it's typically not live unlike this, we will edit that out and take the best parts in. And then on top of the transparency to build that trust, I tell them, I will let you review the edited audio file before it is released so you can approve of it. And that's a huge win, because a lot of people say, oh, I get to review it before it's released, so I don't sound like a not so smart person. Great. I'm in, right? So A, it's related to them. B, they can see the questions, and C, they can review the final result before it's released to the public, so that they avoid embarrassment. And D, you can potentially promote the product or service if it makes sense.
Right. And to your point about making people feel comfortable coming on your show is huge, because they, like CNN and Fox, they have experts on there for 10 minutes and they're just screaming at each other, yelling at each other. And that makes exciting TV, but that's not what a podcast is about. A podcast helps you dive really deep on a topic, and it lets a person, it lets a person explain in a deeper way. You know what I mean? So it's not about just these talking points. It's about diving deep. And I think that's what will attract people to coming on your show. So putting in things like, the questions, and putting in things like you can review the show before it goes live is going to help make people more comfortable coming on your show.
For sure. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep. And then during the show, unless you have more things to cover during the show, you want to listen carefully to what they say, right? Because they may use acronyms, for example, especially if you're into technical or business things that people may not be familiar with. It's like, what's ROI stand for? It's like, oh, okay. Oh, let's clarify what that acronym actually means. Oh, return on investment. Okay, fine. Or if they use some jargon that's not clear. And then also you want to ask clarifying questions if a point isn't clear, even if they don't use jargon or acronyms, to clarify for the audience or yourself for that matter. So it's worth taking a look at all those things. And here's Tyler. Tyler has joined us as well.
And to add on to during the show, you might need a mic, Tyler, or no, you're fine. Okay. I heard echo. Anyway, okay. Yeah. So during the show, like you said, just like remaining focused is the key. And zoning in is kind of like being a sprinter, or like being a basketball player in the fourth quarter, getting in the zone. You have to be able to have that space in your office, in your studio, wherever that is, where you can kind of block everything else out. While you're interviewing a person, nothing else in the world should matter. Correct. It should just be you and that person. It's something that we don't And that's my favorite part of podcasting, because if you find a great guest and you guys connect, then it can become a almost a religious experience, because you guys connect on a deeper level, depending on the guest. Not always, but depending on the guest. And then, and that's the beauty of podcasting for me, is that you get to really, there's no cell phones, there's no televisions in the background, there's no kids running around yelling, it's just, there's no fires to put out at work. It's just you and another person learning from each other and diving deep on the topic. So that's the whole key. If you say like 1,000 times, if you say if you mess up and misspeak a word or have to go back, none of that really matters, as long as you can build a connection with the person you're interviewing.
Yeah, exactly. And then as long as it's not too distracting for the audience too, right? And you'll be able to tell when you review the audio. So make sure it's on airplane mode, yes. so that it's not a distraction, and you're not getting pinged by anybody for that matter during the show. To Raz's point, that you were mentioning taking pauses between questions and answers to make sure that the other party is done speaking. Because a common challenge is crosstalk, right? Yeah. Where you think they're done, but they're actually taking a mental pause, and they're like, "Did they finish their answer? I don't know. Let's pause and wait and see." And then 5 seconds later, they're like, "Okay, I'm going to ask the next question." and on occasion, there are hiccups in either the bandwidth, or there's a technical challenge. Or there's a drop off in the Wi-Fi, or who knows, right? Or a mic, cuts out or something, and you just have to re-record that question, right? Or re-record part of it. I was like, I missed that part. It's like it depends, because some people like to read scripts, and usually you can tell, which is bad. I prefer show notes, right? Where you have, like, in theory, if I give you 5 questions, which typically I do ahead of time, you're going to write some notes, like points you want to talk about, right? Like, I'm going to talk about point A, B, and C, right? For question 1. Great. Don't read a script, because then it will be very obvious that I am reading a script, and it will sound very monotone, and it will be great. Actually, it won't. It will be terrible. And then when you mess up on the script, you're going to just like, oh, let me reread that for the 4th time. Right. I've had that happen several times with guests, and it's painful for the guests. It's even more painful for me when I have to edit it, which is not fun. So listen carefully and see, do you really need to re-say the whole answer, or can you just say the sentence that died for whatever reason, and needed to be revived and said better in maybe a different way to make said point.
I agree. Another resource that's kind of prep work and kind of during the show is Toastmasters. If you've never joined the Toastmasters group before or have heard of them, you should look one up close to you, and go to a session, join a session. I think they're free to go the first couple of times, and just see what kind of feedback they give you. And then you can work on that. And if you enjoy it, you can join it, because it's a great organization. But if not, maybe you can just learn a little something that can help you better present your ideas as a host. And yes, and I've heard from several podcast guests. There was one guy, he had been on 1,000 podcasts or something like that. Was his claim to fame. He was like a guest on 1,000 podcasts, and he said the worst podcasts are ones where the host is not engaging. He's just reading questions from a script, and he's not really listening, and he doesn't even know if you're there or not. He's just reading the questions. He's just wanting the content. And he said those are the worst podcasts. So I suggest having questions and sending them to the guest, but also like listening when the guest says something, because sometimes that answer can lead to a deeper answer that you can take, on a side quest, and to dive deeper. So, have questions there to help get you out of trouble, but also listen to what your guest is saying, because that's the reason they're there.
Exactly. Yeah. Because if I just read a script of questions, like question 1, okay, question 2,
right.
That's about as engaging as, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Right.
Brett, you have the exact reaction that I would expect. Actually, no, it would not. It would be very sad. It's like, You'd be like crying, and as you turn it off.
Right.
And I should be crying for creating something like that.
Yeah.
That boring.
Yeah. And then the worst part is you don't connect with the guest at all, because that's another offshoot, like the secret of podcasting, I say, is that after a podcast is over, you have the opportunity to connect with the guest or invite them to meetings, or they'll invite you to speak somewhere, or they'll invite you to a group they're part of, or they'll send you clients. But if you don't connect with the guest, none of that's going to happen.
True.
Yeah. Because even if you don't have 100,000 people downloading your podcast every month, if you can connect with, 4 guests a month or 2 guests a month on a deeper level, that can take your business to extreme heights. But you have to connect with them.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's multiple ways to connect with people. Like we mentioned the social media networks, in a previous, Savannah podcast meetup, we talked about all the different places you can find, places to sign up for guests, right? Or to be a guest for that matter. There's a new one called Podcast Movement University. I think they launched. That's the brand spanking new one. And I recently signed up for Matchmaker.fm and gotten awesome results. So that's a new revelation for me. But LinkedIn is still my preferred channel for finding lots and lots of people. What else should we talk about during the show?
Oz. We talked about this with Brett before the show a little bit, and that podcasts are different than radio. You don't have to fill every single moment of silence. So filler words aren't as needed during a podcast because you can have a little pause, and then people will lean in a little bit more if you just pause and take a break versus like that, which I do terribly, but everybody does a little bit. Yeah.
And there's ways to control it, right? If you're super conscious about it, if you really, really need to control it because you're saying like every other word, right? Then it's probably a little bit more distracting and you need to work on that, right? Not that you do, and then something else to consider, you talked about the turnarounds, which is a great podcast. The exercise asking better questions. That's a huge thing that a lot of podcasters talk about. Ask less yes or no questions and ask a lot more thought-provoking questions, like open-ended questions that are going to lead to a longer answer, a lot more meat to talk about, right? Or vegetables to talk about that are going to be more to chew on, mentally speaking. And so that it's going to entertain, it's going to inform, it's going to engage the audience and the guest, and the host, as well as, more importantly, so everybody is going to engage and entertain and inform everybody. That's the goal of the podcast, right? Is to do some of those things. Because if you're just like rambling, it's like, what's the point? It's like, I've come for the rambling of the day. I'm not a fan of those myself.
And I'm glad you said that, Henrik. One of the most not inspirational, but one of the quotes that stuck out to me for a long time, and I remember it to this day. I listened to this podcast like 5 years ago. It was Tim Ferriss, and he interviewed Cal Newport years ago, the famous author and sports journalist. And he actually interviewed it wasn't Putin, but it was a Russian I don't know if it's prime minister or president, anyway, a Russian leader. And what he said was that, his first question was something really, it was really emotional. So like, got to the heart of the matter. So I took that and I created my first question on all my podcasts. And it's, here it is. Henrik, if you're walking through your neighborhood, a little kid comes up to you and says, Henrik, you're my hero. How can I be like you when I grow up? And in the language that a 10 to 12-year-old can understand, what does it take to be Henrik de jour, right? That's my first question in all my podcasts. And if you start with something like that, something that gets to the heart of a person and lets them kind of open up, bare their soul a little bit, then everything else will just flow. The entire interview will just open up if you just start with something, a question like that.
That's a deep question, right?
It is.
And probably a deep. Sorry, good.
Yeah, and people aren't ready for it. They don't know what to expect, but it does allow them to think kind of childlike. It gets them thinking less. They're taken off by it. They're less defensive. They're less professional, but they also say something extremely heartwarming and helpful and honest. When I start with that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and it'll make it simple too to all audiences, because likely people slightly over 10 will listen to the podcast, but it'll make it to the simplest terms what makes you a good person, right?
Right. So that even intellectuals can understand it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, hopefully they too.
Yeah.
They can dissect it a little bit more.
Yeah.
So, anything else during the show?
No, I think that's it for me.
Okay, so how about after the show? What should we do?
So post show as a host is follow up. They say the fortune is in the follow up. So just follow up. Make sure send people the link when it comes out. Give them an opportunity. Send them a widget or send them all the social media or whatever clips you do, so they have the opportunity to share it. Tag them in all the posts you make so they can be seen and share it with their audience as well. And then just tell them thank you. Or send them a gift if you can get it, like a little coffee mug, or get a hat, or get a pen or a sticker or something like that, or even just a handwritten note to say thank you for coming on the show. All of that stuff matters. It's the little things that matter.
Mm-hmm. Things that typically most people don't do, right?
Right.
Because how many handwritten notes do you get nowadays?
Very few.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, especially now.
Yeah.
So things that make you stand out, people will remember that big time, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah, and then you can, right after the show, like literally after you stop recording, and maybe you continue the conversation afterwards. Usually I find the guests to be very generous, and sometimes the hosts as well, honestly, where they talk about details that they didn't necessarily want to talk during the show, but you can continue recording, hypothetically speaking, and maybe add that in without them not necessarily not knowing, but tell them, it's like, oh, I'm curious about this and this and this, right? After the show. And if it's like super valuable, you can either do it like the after the outro, you can continue the riff around like some detail that may be less relevant, that kind of thing. Some shows have that, where it's like, oh, wow, that's some seriously awesome detail that we kind of skipped over. But you can ask them for other guests to interview.
That's a big one.
Yeah, that's a huge one. Like I asked recently, somebody was like, oh, who do you think I should interview about this topic as well? And the guy rattled off 6 names. Mm-hmm. And he said, I'll introduce you all to every single one of them. Mm-hmm. And I got almost every single one as a future guest, awesome. Which is a huge win, right? As a podcaster. Mm-hmm. And then of course, if there's other businesses that you want to promote, similar to the ones that you already talked to, same thing. That's huge for monetization, right? And for growth in general, business growth to all parties, right? Because podcast is basically almost like a free advertisement, if you think about it, right? You advertise sometimes on shows if you have a big enough audience, but if you mention it during the show rather than saying, and this is brought to you by blah, 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 right? Or sponsored by whatever, right? That's one thing, but if you're literally talking about it during the show, I think it has more credit, if you will, in the audience's perspective, because they're listening because there's set authority talking about XYZ product or service, right? And then the host is promoting it too, by default, right? Because you're allowing the airtime for them to talk about said thing, right? Even if it's an indirect way. And so that can work. And then what else? We talked about the approvals after editing. That's a big thing, so that you're transparent about it. No gotchas, no surprises. It's like, oh, you remember all the ahs and stuff? I threw that all more in. No, that doesn't happen.
Right. I extended it. I made them longer.
I slowed them down.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
that would be the worst possible thing you could do as a host.
It would, yeah.
so but if you can cross promote each other, that's huge, right?
Mhm.
And that's partially why you want to have certain guests on the show, is if they have a good following and you have a good following, you can cross promote each other's through each other's networks. Now, some people are terrible at that, and some people are really good. And there's a variety of factors why. I think the easier you make it to promote what you're trying to promote, like you literally give them the verbatim script in an email saying, hey, I'd love for you to help me cross promote or promote this or share this, right? And you make it really explicit, and you give them literally the 2 lines of text with the hashtags and links and blah, 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 that they just have to copy and paste and share. That's a huge win too, it for said purpose, typically. How often that happens, that's I guess that's more follow-up, right? To your point. Mm-hmm.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's it for me.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think emailing them right after, or the day or the morning of the show release, that's huge, as well. So that they know A, it's come out, and B, they know when to promote. And there's where you can start dropping like hints like, oh, can you please share this blah, blah, blah text or something similar. It doesn't matter if they want to change it up. You can also ask the guests for feedback, like, oh, what's missing from the show? What would you change? Right. So getting honest feedback from them. Some people will be honest. Some people will just be nice and say, it was great. It was good, which is not that helpful, honestly. It's like, okay, thanks.
Yeah.
But anything that will help the future of the topic or of the show, like saying, oh, have you considered asking this question instead, or along with your questions, right?
Mm-hmm.
That can be very powerful, like the question that you suggested. And then what else? Asking them to subscribe and promote the show, of course, at least that recording of them. That's usually more common than the whole show. And then, questions from anybody?
And I guess my final thought would be is that if once you start, do your best to keep going.
Oh yeah.
Because it's on the job training basically. So like, you're going to get better as time goes on. Like your first interview is going to be not the best, but you can only get better. Joe Rogan, one of the most popular podcaster right now. If you go back and listen to episode 1, it was horrible. Completely horrible. Or his early episodes were terrible. He was like yelling and trying to be the jock type of guy, but that's just not, it wasn't good. But he's evolved over the years, and you will too.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. Don't measure yourself by based on just what one person does or what your first 10 episodes sound like. You need to keep to your point, Raz, the consistency of your show. So if you set a cadence of say weekly or every 2 weeks or once a month or whatever that is, I don't recommend starting daily because that's a lot of work.
Yes.
Not everyone's John Lee Dumas,
right?
Where he does like 8 in one day and then he like pushes them out. He obviously has a process and it works really well for him. And 2,000 plus episodes later. But make it sustainable for yourself, right? And have a buffer of episodes in your back pocket so that, like I record several in a month, right? Knowing that for the next month, I already have recorded some. So I'll record for several months at a time or the entire series at a time. Like I've done like 52 episodes first, write a book about it, and then promote the book with every single episode. That works, right? Then everything's recorded, everything's set, everything's approved, and you just push schedule everything and you're done. But most people do it a little slower. They do like handful of episodes. Like Trevina last month, she talked about doing 4 at a time. That's a very manageable amount, especially if it's just you doing solo, talking to the mic kind of thing, or scheduling four interviews in a couple weeks or a week. Right. I like doing back to back. I like batching. That's just me. But that's an efficiency of the host, right? And it simplifies things for me and automates, back to Trevina's points. Anything else that we missed, Tyler or Brett, that you have questions on or you want to make points on?
Super helpful for me.
Okay,
I'm
great.
still new and learning how to be a host.
Tyler is still learning. Okay, no worries. Yeah, and Brett, I think you're launching soon. So
Yeah, absolutely. I'm launching soon. What about agreements with the guests? And do you have signed contracts, like who owns the material and things like that? Legalese, right?
mm-hmm. Yeah.
I don't personally, but I know our mastermind friend. I can't think of his name.
Alex.
Yeah, our mastermind friend Alex. We just had one mastermind session so far. He has one, and it's a really in-depth one, but also simple. And it's just on a Google Docs that he has everybody sign, go through before they come on the show, and it just says things like, we own this, basically. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. But I don't know. For what I do, I don't. But maybe I'm thinking more and more about it, because as podcasting becomes more popular, there are also downsides to it, I'm sure. So yeah, I think I'll start doing it.
Yeah, because if you give the preamble like legalese, like I will own all the content, I can do anything I want with it, blah blah blah, that it puts it up front, right? And they have to approve in order for you to move forward with the interview, blah 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 blah. So it gives you more freedom on how you want to use the content. What I do is in the email I say this is my intent with the podcast interview. I plan to transcribe it. I plan to potentially make it into a book. What you said. I plan to have you approve of the content prior to. I plan to do this and this and this and this, and then I actually ask for written email form. Written, do you approve as is, or do you require other edits? And then if they say approve as is, that's technically legal, because it's approved in writing with date, time stamp, et cetera, and emails are legally binding information if you word it the right way. Because obviously if it's not 123 cat@gmail.com or something, but something a little bit more formal, like your name, especially at a company name. So does that answer your question, Brett? Yeah, super, great. I've even seen people put it in their Calendly invite as part of the process, where it leads to a Gmail link or a Google Docs link where they get to read the legalese and they approve, and it's a checkbox basically. And then it tells them the formats, it tells them all the questions, it tells them everything, and then it literally pushes out a Zoom or a Google Meet or whatever you're going to use, Citrix, et cetera, to record on said date, said time, because they're scheduling when you want that block of time to interview. So using Calendly or Schedule Once or whatever your favorite tool is to book in advance, that's a huge win too, because it saves you so much time from the back and forth. Like, oh, would you like to do Thursday? How about Friday? Oh, 4 o'clock? No. Oh, 2. Oh, no. How about next week? No. No 15 emails just to schedule one person. Yeah. It's like here's a link. Oh, you've booked. Great. Thank you. Yeah. Done. See you then. Yeah. Very quick and forward, providing all the questions. And then of course, sending your email address in case they have additional questions, which on occasion they do, of course. But making them, back to your point, comfortable with whatever's important to share. Yep.
Correct.
Yep. Anything else, or are we good?
I think that's it. Right. People can find us on meetup.com or on our personal websites, henrikdegura.com or tarazmisha.com if they want to ask questions. And we can, we invite a lot of questions. If you're watching this on YouTube, please send us questions so we know what to talk about on the next Savannah Podcast and Meetup.
For sure. Yeah. Thank you so much for making the time.